The head of the most feared prince in Eastern Europe did not arrive in Constantinople with the dignity of a fallen king. It arrived submerged in a jar of honey, severed from its body, a grisly trophy for an Ottoman sultan who had spent years hunting him. Vlad III, the voivode of Wallachia, known as the Impaler, had built a reputation so terrifying that entire armies broke at the mere mention of his approach. But psychological warfare could not stop a blade in the winter mud. In the freezing weeks of late 1476, the man who had turned the forests of the Balkans into monuments of human agony met a deeply unglamorous end. This is the story of Vlad Dracula's final hours, where the architect of 1,000 nightmares was finally consumed by the very brutality he had perfected. The end began not with a grand final stand, but in a chaotic, freezing ambush. Overrun by Ottomans in his final stand, he had reclaimed his throne for less than 2 months. That was all the time the political realities of the 15th century Balkans allowed him. By late November 1476, Vlad had successfully driven out the Ottoman-backed usurper Basarab Laiotă, reclaiming the capital of Bucharest with the heavy military backing of Stephen the Great of Moldavia and the Hungarian forces of Stephen V Bathory. For a brief moment, it appeared the Impaler had fully returned to power, ready to resume his iron-fisted rule over the fractured Wallachian state. But alliances in the medieval frontier were transactional, and armies were expensive to keep in the field during the bitter cold. Believing the region secured, his powerful allies withdrew their forces, marching north to their own territories. Vlad was left with a dangerously small retinue, perhaps numbering fewer than 4,000 loyal men, to hold a kingdom completely surrounded by enemies. That was the fatal miscalculation. Basarab Laiotă had not been destroyed. He had simply retreated across the Danube to regroup. Buoyed by fresh reinforcements from the Ottoman Empire, Laiotă marched back into Wallachia almost immediately. The Ottoman war machine, commanded by battle-hardened frontier commanders, moved with a speed that caught the Wallachian defenders off guard. The exact location of the final clash remains obscured by centuries of conflicting accounts, though most historians place it somewhere on the road between Bucharest and the fortified Danube port of Giurgiu. What is heavily documented is the desperate nature of the encounter. The Wallachian winter was unforgiving. The ground would have been frozen hard, the dense forests stripped of foliage, offering little cover for a small force trying to maneuver against a larger army. Vlad's small contingent found itself suddenly overwhelmed by the advancing Ottoman vanguard. He had fought his way out of impossible odds before, utilizing guerrilla tactics, scorched earth policies, and night attacks that shattered enemy morale. He knew how to leverage fear better than any commander of his age. But here's the thing about ruling entirely through terror. When the tide of battle turns, fear rarely inspires loyalty. Vlad had spent his previous reigns systematically decimating the Wallachian nobility, the boyars, impaling them by the hundreds to centralize his own power. He had destroyed the very class of military elites who would normally rally their own peasant levies to defend the crown. In his final hours, standing in the freezing mud against an overwhelming Ottoman force, he found himself leading men whose primary loyalty lay with survival, not with their prince. The battle devolved rapidly from a defensive stand into a fragmented, brutal skirmish in the heavy fog and bare trees. The Ottoman forces, utilizing their superior numbers and highly disciplined Janissary infantry, collapsed the Wallachian flanks. There was no grand strategy left to deploy, no elaborate trap to spring. It was a chaotic clash of steel, desperate shouting, and men dying in the freezing dirt. He had survived decades of imprisonment, betrayal, and war by outthinking and out-terrifying his opponents. But the winter of 1476 was different. This time, the forest offered no sanctuary, and the men closing in around him could not be frightened away. Decapitated in the winter mud. The exact strike that ended the life of Vlad the Impaler remains buried in the confusion of medieval combat. What is certain is the profound indignity of his final moments. According to a surviving account written by the Russian diplomat Fedor Kuritsyn shortly after the events, Vlad's death was an accidental byproduct of his own aggressive command style. Kuritsyn recorded that as the Wallachians successfully repelled an initial Ottoman surge, Vlad rode to the top of a small hill to observe the retreating enemy, pulling away from the protective circle of his guards. In the chaotic, low-visibility environment of a 15th century battlefield, he was allegedly mistaken for an Ottoman commander by his own men. According to this version of events, one of his own soldiers fatally wounded him, striking a fatal blow before realizing he had killed his sovereign. Other historical sources, however, suggest a far more calculated end. The Wallachian boyars who marched with him knew that Basarab Laiotă was returning with overwhelming force. Many of these nobles had secretly maintained back-channel communications with the Ottomans to ensure their own lands and lives would be spared. In this narrative, Vlad was not struck by a blind lance in the fog, but assassinated in the midst of the fighting by men who had simply decided his reign was no longer politically viable. He was struck down from behind, betrayed by the very nobles he had spent a lifetime trying to break. Whatever the precise mechanism of his death, what followed was a demonstration of how power operated on the Ottoman frontier. A dead prince on a battlefield was only a rumor. To claim the throne, Basarab Laiotă and his Ottoman backers needed undeniable physical proof. The surviving accounts state that Ottoman soldiers, or perhaps Laiotă's own men, descended upon the fallen voivode. They did not prepare the body for transport or treat the remains with the customary respect afforded to Christian nobility. Instead, they took his life directly. The execution was not a ceremonial event, but a battlefield elimination performed in the freezing mud. They removed his head, separating it from the rest of his body, reducing a man who had commanded absolute authority into a gruesome piece of political currency. The removal of the head was a standard practice in ancient and medieval warfare, serving as an undeniable receipt of victory. But for Vlad, it carried a specific heavy irony. He had made his name by mutilating the bodies of his enemies, leaving thousands of corpses on display to send a message of absolute dominance. Now his own corpse was being dismantled to send a message to the rest of Europe. The physical reality of this moment is stark. The heavy furs and armor he wore would have been stripped away as loot. The man who had dined among a forest of impaled victims outside Târgoviște, seemingly immune to the horrors of violence, was left bleeding out into the frozen Wallachian soil. The body was abandoned, a discarded shell of a deeply feared man. The real prize was already moving south, carefully preserved for a sultan who demanded absolute proof. Head displayed on a spike in Constantinople. A journey of over 400 miles separated the freezing plains of Wallachia from the warm, opulent capital of the Ottoman Empire. For the courier carrying a sealed leather bag, speed was essential. To survive the long journey south across the Danube, through the treacherous passes of the Balkan Mountains, and down into the Thracian plains, the severed head of Vlad Dracula had to be protected from decomposition. The Ottomans employed a common medieval method for this grim logistical challenge. The head was submerged in a container filled with wild honey. The natural antibacterial properties of the honey acted as a preservative, arresting the decay of the flesh and ensuring that the facial features would remain recognizable upon arrival. When the courier finally rode through the massive stone gates of Constantinople, he carried the conclusion to one of the most bitter personal rivalries of the 15th century. Sultan Mehmed II, known as the Conqueror, had not forgotten Vlad. Years earlier, in the summer of 1462, Mehmed had personally led a massive invasion force into Wallachia, intent on turning the territory into an Ottoman province. During that campaign, Vlad had launched a daring night attack directly into the Sultan's camp, aiming to assassinate Mehmed in his tent. The attack failed, but the psychological impact was profound. Days later, as the Ottoman army marched toward the Wallachian capital of Târgoviște, Mehmed encountered a sight that halted his advance: the Forest of the Impaled. Over 20,000 Ottoman prisoners of war and Wallachian civilians had been impaled on tall wooden stakes, their bodies left to rot in the sun. The Greek historian Laonikos Chalkokondyles recorded that even the Sultan, a man who had conquered Constantinople and shattered empires, stood in stunned silence before the horrific display, marveling at the ruthless psychological warfare of the Wallachian prince. Now, 14 years later, the architect of that forest was dead. Mehmed ordered the head to be taken from the honey and prepared for public display. The Ottoman authorities wanted no ambiguity regarding the fate of the rebellious prince. According to contemporary chroniclers, the head was driven onto a high wooden stake and erected in a prominent public square in Constantinople. The contrast is inescapable. The man who had revolutionized the use of the wooden stake as an instrument of state terror, who had impaled thousands to secure his borders and punish his enemies, ended his narrative mounted on a stake himself. The citizens of Constantinople, many of whom had lost sons, brothers and fathers to Vlad's campaigns, gathered to look up at the preserved features of the Kazikli voivode, the Impaler Lord. His heavy moustache, his intense, wide-set eyes, now fixed in a lifeless stare above the bustling streets of the imperial capital. It was a profound psychological victory for the Ottoman state. The display demonstrated to the populace and to foreign ambassadors residing in the city that the Sultan's reach was absolute. No enemy, no matter how terrifying, could escape Ottoman justice. The head remained on the spike until the elements and carrion birds reduced it to nothing. The Ottoman capital celebrated the final elimination of a long-standing nightmare. But back in the Wallachian winter, a different kind of erasure was taking place. Corpse abandoned in an unmarked grave. There were no royal honours for the remains left bleeding into the snow. In the 15th century, a king's burial was a final assertion of legitimacy, a monumental resting place designed to anchor a dynasty's claim to the land. Vlad was denied even this basic right of sovereignty. With his head travelling south to the Sultan, the headless corpse remained on the battlefield, stripped of its princely regalia and left to the mercy of scavengers. Wallachia was now under the firm control of Basarab Laiotă. To offer a proper state funeral for the fallen voivode would have been an act of treason against the new regime. Furthermore, a marked, elaborate grave for Vlad the Impaler would have created a dangerous focal point for future rebellions, a shrine where loyalists might gather to plot against the Ottoman-backed leadership. The historical record grows highly fragmented regarding what happened next. Local folklore and monastic traditions suggest that the corpse was eventually discovered by local peasants or monks who recognized the remains. In these accounts, the body was hastily carried away under the cover of darkness to be given a Christian burial. For centuries, local tradition held that his remains were interred at the Snagov Monastery, located on an island in the middle of a lake near Bucharest. The monastery was a strategic, heavily fortified site that Vlad himself had expanded and utilized during his reigns. It seemed a fitting, isolated resting place for a man who lived a life surrounded by enemies. But here's what actually happened when modern science attempted to verify the legend. In the early 1930s, Romanian archaeologist Dinu Rosetti secured permission to excavate the presumed tomb of Vlad the Impaler, situated prominently in front of the altar at Snagov Monastery. When the heavy stone slab was lifted, the researchers found no royal remains, no armor, and no headless skeleton. Instead, the trench contained only dirt, some fragmented ceramics, and a collection of animal bones. The primary tomb was a decoy. However, during the same excavation, Archaeologists found a second unmarked grave located further back in the church near the entrance. Inside this hidden pit, they uncovered a skeleton draped in the decaying heavy fragments of purple velvet and yellow silk, colors reserved exclusively for high nobility. The skeleton was missing its skull. While many historians believe this second grave at Snagov may indeed belong to Vlad, others argue for the Kamana monastery, another religious house founded by the Impaler much closer to the presumed site of the fatal battle. The lack of identifying inscriptions means absolute certainty will forever remain out of reach. The men who buried him deliberately erased his identity to protect his remains from desecration by Laiota's forces. This final anonymity stands in stark opposition to the sheer volume of his life. A ruler who forced the entire world to acknowledge his presence through spectacular acts of violence was ultimately forced into the earth in total silence, hidden beneath unmarked stone. He vanished into the soil he had drenched in blood, leaving behind a physical void that allowed his legacy to mutate into something entirely unrecognizable over the centuries. The historical reality of Vlad the Impaler is one of absolute warfare, political desperation, and a deeply ugly death in the winter mud. He was not a supernatural entity, but a localized prince who used extreme cruelty as a blunt instrument of statecraft.